Steady Eddie had a very special wash this morning. He wanted to be as clean as possible today. He wanted his wheels polished, he wanted his bumper painted, and he wanted his windscreen to be sparkling clean. Today was such a special day that he even washed in all the little places that he usually forgot to wash. Steady Eddie was feeling very important as he drove along the motorway. He had been chosen as a special guest of honour at the opening of the new Children's Adventure Park. He was going to press the big red button that started all of the rides. He was very excited, but also was a little nervous. He had never been asked to do this type of thing before. Arriving at the park, he was surprised by how many people were there. All the children were shouting and cheering. They were very excited because they would soon be able to try all the new rides. Steady Eddie stopped and looked at the rides in astonishment. "Look how high they are!" he exclaimed. "I would be too frightened to try those rides, so I'll keep my wheels firmly on the ground," he promised himself. This was a promise that he later wished he had kept. Each of the rides in the new park had a name, and even the names were enough to frighten Steady Eddie. Names such as Whizzing Top, Meet the Monsters, and Danger in the Jungle. That's the one where spiders, snakes, crocodiles, and other creatures leap out to frighten you. One ride was so frightening that it had a sign on the gate which said, "Children only, not recommended for parents." This was the train trip of terror. At 10 a.m. the band began to play. They were all dressed in their new blue uniforms. They had polished their trumpets, trombones, and tubas so much that Steady Eddie could see his reflection in them. When the band began to play, Steady Eddie quickly made his way to the big stage, where a man was announcing what was about to happen. "Now it gives me great pleasure," he said, "to ask Steady Eddie, our special guest today, to press the button to start the rides." Steady Eddie moved towards the big red button on the ground, and the crowd began to cheer and clap. He rolled one of his big wheels over the button, and as he did so, all the rides began to move. All over the park, the sound of children screaming with delight and parents screaming with fear as the rides began. When the train trip of terror came past him, Steady Eddie saw the children waving their hands in the air, having fun, and all the parents holding their hands over their eyes in fear. Steady Eddie had never seen so many people having such fun. He decided to stay a little while longer, but as he watched the rides going round and round, he began to get dizzy. At one point so dizzy watching the whizzing top that he could see two of everything. "Oh dear," he said, "I think it's time for me to go home now." But he was so dizzy that as he set off he took a wrong turning. Instead of turning right to go back to the road, he turned left. Oh dear, he made a terrible mistake. Instead of driving onto the road, he had driven onto the tracks of the train trip of terror. As he was still dizzy from watching the whizzing top spinning around, Steady Eddie did not realise his mistake at first. He was still seeing two of everything. It was only when he started to climb upwards that he began to suspect something was wrong. "That's strange. I don't remember a hill," he thought. As he looked down, he saw that the ground was getting further and further away from him. "Oh no!" he cried. He shut his eyes and screamed at the top of his voice, "Help! Help! Help!" Not knowing what to do, Steady Eddie struggled to get to the top of the ride. He couldn't reverse all the way back down. He couldn't jump off because it was too high, and he would have hurt himself in the fall. The only thing he could do was keep going. When he came to the top of the climb, he stopped, He looked down, and there in the distance was the ground. He was absolutely terrified. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. This was all he could say. He tried to say something else, but all that came out was, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. All the people on the ground looked as small as ants. He noticed that they were all looking at him. They were pointing behind him and shouting something to him, but it was so high up that he couldn't hear what they were saying. The crowd continued to point behind him, so he turned round to see what was there and what they were pointing at. Although he couldn't see anything, he could hear children screaming with excitement. I wonder what they're screaming for, he thought to himself as he looked around. Then he saw it charging towards him. Ah! He cried, help! Steady Eddie had the shock of his life. Coming up behind him was the train trip of terror. It was hooting and whistling at him to get out of the way. The train was full of children who all thought Steady Eddie had decided to be brave and try the ride after all. Hooray for Steady Eddie, they cried. He is brave after all. But they didn't realise just how frightened he actually was. As it got closer to him, the train was shouting at him, get out of the way, get out of the way. Steady Eddie did not know what to do. He couldn't jump off because the ground was too far. He couldn't go backwards downhill because the train was right behind him. If he stayed where he was, the train would crash into him. Steady Eddie looked down to the ground in the distance. He glanced back at the train which had almost reached him. He looked down at the ground again. Oh dear, he cried. There was only one thing to do. Steady Eddie did the only thing he could do. He closed his eyes and began to roll forward. Down the steep slope, the train was now right behind him. Faster and faster they both went. Steady Eddie peeped through one eye to see what was happening, and he saw the ground rushing towards him. Oh dear, he cried and shut his eyes again. Right down to the bottom of the slope they went, with the train following close behind Steady Eddie. As they reached the bottom of the slope, Steady Eddie breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, I've made it. I'm safely on the ground again. Then he realised that he couldn't find a way to get off the ride. How do I get off? He asked the train. Get off? Get off? Asked the train. What do you mean get off? The ride only has one. Has only just started. Steady Eddie could not believe his words. I only came to press the big red button, he screamed. Poor Steady Eddie. He was trapped on the ride, and he had to keep going because the train was right behind him. Keep going, shouted the train. The ride began to get faster and faster. It was going so fast round some of the corners that Steady Eddie thought he was going to fall off. All the time the train was right behind him, whistling and blowing his hooter. The faster Steady Eddie went, the faster the train went. The crowd all rushed to see Steady Eddie on the ride. Every time he came round, the crowd all clapped and cheered. Look how brave Steady Eddie is, said all the children to their parents. He's not frightened to go on the rides, so why don't you go on them? Little did they realise that Steady Eddie was shaking so much with fear that he was almost falling off. Faster and faster the ride went. Steady Eddie was wondering when the ride would ever stop. He was wondering when he could get off and put his wheels back on solid ground again. Just then he saw something that made him gulp with fear, for there, round the next bend, was a double loop-the-loop. There was no way he could stop because the train was still right behind him. There was no way he could jump off because he was going too fast. All he could do was to close his eyes and scream. So he screamed just as loudly as the children in the train behind him were screaming. Ah! He screamed as he did the first of the somersaults through the air. Oh, he felt unwell after that. Then he had to do it again. Ah! He cried as he went around again. Everything had turned upside down and then back again twice. Oh, I don't feel well, he moaned. I think I'm going to be sick. After the second somersault, the ride began to slow down. Slower and slower it went, and Steady Eddie followed the track along till they came to the end of the ride. He was so frightened from the experience that the men had to help him off carefully. Steady Eddie was shaking all over. All he could say was, "I've made it! I've made it! I've survived the train trip of terror." Very slowly, Steady Eddie began to recover, and after a few minutes he was able to drive by himself without any help from the men to guide him. As he drove away, he drove past all the children who had joined the queue to go back on the ride. "Come back with us!" they shouted. "That was fun chasing you. Let us do it again." "No, no," replied Steady Eddie, with just a hint of panic in his voice. "Never again. Definitely never again." Steady Eddie stayed a little longer, but then decided it was time to leave. He'd had enough adventures in the adventure park for one day. He thanked the people for inviting him and for making him a special guest. They gave him lifetime membership of the park so that any time he wanted to, he could come in and try the rides again. They also gave him a large photograph of the opening ceremony to hang on his wall at home. With that, they waved goodbye and he set off home. When he arrived home, Steady Eddie had another wash. 2 washes in one day. He loved to have a warm shower before going to bed. He was being washed. He thought about As he was being washed, he thought about the big rides and the train trip of terror with its double somersault. He began to feel dizzy again, just thinking about it. He hoped he wouldn't have an adventure like that one again anytime soon. And that was the Adventures of Steady Eddie, the Adventure Park.